Welcome to Washington Legal Foundation's webinar. My name is Glenn Lammy. I am Executive Director and Vice President of Legal Studies here. For those of you not familiar with the Foundation, we are in our 49th year of free enterprise advocacy and education on a wide range of issues that affect the free enterprise system. We advocate for the rule of law, economic and individual liberties, and the separation of powers. This program is one of a series of programs that we do as webinars. We did one actually just yesterday that previews the second half of the U.S. Supreme Court's October 2025 term. That's available as a recording right now on our website if you'd like to check that out. And next week, we're doing a program on a proposal in California to change the antitrust laws specific to that state that could potentially be at odds with the way that the rest of the country looks at it, especially in the federal courts. So in the early 1990s, America had a new president from Hope, Arkansas, and a commissioner of the FDA with a penchant for paternalism. The FDA took an aggressive approach to the consumer-directed advertising of pharmaceutical products. That approach, thankfully, did not endure, thanks in part to a strong pushback by advertisers, patients, and interest groups like Washington Legal Foundation. So for the past 20 years or so, information has flowed a little bit more freely about life-saving and life-enhancing treatments. So fast forward to last year, 2025, when a mercurial HHS secretary and his compliant FDA commissioner pushed us back to the 1990s with an assault on DTC advertising that continues into this year, 2026. We brought together an outstanding panel today to talk about the statutory and constitutional concerns surrounding this crackdown and its impact on patients. I'll introduce our speakers before we get started. Dara Katcher-Levy is a director with Hyman Phelps and McNamara. She assists clients on products ranging from orphan drugs to blockbuster pharmaceuticals, providing key support for marketing initiatives, social media and digital tactics, television advertisements, and traditional healthcare professional and direct-to-consumer materials. She writes regularly on these and other issues for the firm's award-winning FDA law blog. Joining us also is John Swartaki, who goes by CZ. He's the executive director of the Informed Patients Project. CZ is uniquely aware of the powers of transparency in healthcare. He was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 1993. He served in the executive branch as communications director for the Office of Management and Budget under President Trump's first administration and chief communications officer for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. CZ also served in the legislative branch as press secretary for Congressman John Boehner, communications director for the chairman of House Leadership, Bill Paxton, and press secretary for the Senate Majority Leader, Trent Lott. Finally, joining us, Dan Troy, who's the managing director at Berkeley Research Group. Before joining BRG, Dan was vice president, chief legal officer, and general counsel with Valo Health. Previously to that, he was general counsel of GlaxoSmithKline for 10 years, a partner in the FDA practice at Sidley Austin, and FDA chief counsel. He also clerked for D.C. Circuit Judge Robert H. Bork, and he is, most proudly to us, a member of WLF's Legal Policy Advisory Board. So we're going to be recording this, and if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar toolbar. We will get to those questions probably at the end of the program. So a memo to HHS Secretary Kennedy from the president nominally kicked off activity at HHS and FDA in this area. The memo calls for, quote, actions, quote, to ensure transparency and accuracy in DTC advertising. CZ, I assume that as a patient and as a patient advocate, do you agree that's a laudable goal?
I would wholeheartedly agree. I was very optimistic with the new administration coming in. You have a team here who are consummate professionals. They want to get to the truth and say what things are, no matter how hard or easy they are. So one of the things, though, that I thought was important as I began to hear rumblings that the issues of free flow of information medicine was on the table for discussion, began to get nervous of that. We started the Informed Patient Project to basically safeguard that flow of information, stand up for public policy issues from a patient point of view. So patients who are downstream often perceive how they impact these policies. And I want to say, be able to be the guy who stands up because, frankly, in a nutshell, informed patients are healthier patients. So that's really our mantra.
So statements by the secretary, such as only radical transparency will break the cycle of over-medicalization, which is a new word for me, and by FDA Commissioner Makary, like DTC ads are distorting the patient-doctor relationship, confirmed what this effort would actually look like. CZ, what are your thoughts on the commissioner's statement about ads distorting the relationship that patients have with their
Well,
doctors?
that gave me a lot of pause, frankly, Glenn. You're getting into a lot of subjective terminology here that got the. I'm old enough to remember when we went through a pandemic called COVID-19, when many of these same officials were themselves subject to silencing and censorship based on their own medically verifiable opinions they were sharing. And so I would think that they would, I thought, they would think and instinctually believe that the answer to uncomfortable speech or speech the government doesn't like is not to shut it off, but to have facilitate more speech and more information flow. And so I want to stand here to say we need to get back to that and guard against the opposite. So I'm troubled, but I am like Odie. I'm always optimistic.
Thanks. So the letter that Commissioner Makary sent to thousands of companies, pretty much every company that registered a product with FDA, implied that there was widespread noncompliance with FDA's advertising rules. To sort of level set us, Dara, please describe the rules that companies have to follow and what the consequences are for noncompliance and not following those rules.
Sure. So prescription drug promotion is highly regulated by FDA. There are rules regarding name representation, claim substantiation, rules regarding presenting a fair balance of information. So if you're going to present the benefits of a drug, you need to present the risks also associated with the drug. And I always joke that the term fair balance is one of those terms that, what happens is neither fair nor balanced. One sentence of the indication can trigger 3 paragraphs of safety information in order to adequately communicate the risks with a drug. Promotional labeling, which is like brochures and mailers, need to be accompanied by the prescribing information that's been approved by FDA, and advertisements need to be accompanied by a brief summary. And in the case of broadcast ads, you have your fair balance being met by something called the major statement, which is a statement of the drug's risks that's typically provided somewhere in the commercial. And that statement needs to be clear, conspicuous, and neutral. And in order to meet the brief summary requirement for a broadcast ad, we have adequate provision, which tells the consumer how they can obtain a copy of the prescribing information or the brief summary for the drug that is the subject of the advertisement. Failure to comply with FDA requirements for promotional materials likely results in an enforcement letter. I mean, obviously, depending upon the level of noncompliance, there can be different actions taken, but most commonly we see untitled letters and warning letters. Untitled letters are letters advising that the agency thinks that there's been a violation, but the violation doesn't rise to the same level as a warning letter where the agency is stating that it is prepared to take further action against a company. And in the case of a warning letter, in addition to responding, the company typically needs to engage in some type of corrective advertising that is in the same format as the underlying violative ad to correct the misimpression that may have been left.
And the implications for companies in terms of not following those rules is basically to have your drug labeled as mislabeled, correct?
Absolutely. So the violation of not meeting promotional requirements renders your drug to be misbranded. And the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is the overarching law governing all of the communications and FDA jurisdiction over prescription drugs, has a section on prohibited acts that prohibits the misbranding of a drug in interstate commerce. So your speech can misbrand a drug.
And this is advertising in all kinds of different media, newspapers, magazines, television, social media, et cetera.
Absolutely. Yes.
So Dan, this seems to be a bit more of a confrontational approach that FDA has taken with the advertising companies over the past 3 decades. It would seem that both government and industry benefit from more cooperation. Do you sort of see the same thing, that this is a bit of a change than the last couple of years?
So first of all, thank you, Glenn, for the invitation. And I have to be very clear that my views here are my own. At BRG, where I'm an expert witness, I can't give legal opinions, but Here, I'm only going to give legal opinions. So I do think that this is a much more confrontational approach. In this, look, I mean, regulators and the regulated, there's always an arm's length relationship, notwithstanding some of the more conspiratorial accusations that are lobbed by some in the more fevered swamps. But what used to be DDMAC, what is now OPDP, obviously will give companies, and this is in the regulations, feedback about DTC ads. You're not required to submit your ad, but a lot of people do because you want to try and avoid problems. But that doesn't mean that OPDP is just waving everything through. They give you comments, and at the end of the day, if they don't like your ad, they can send out a letter. But my experience with DTC ads is that basically, to get to a little bit of what CZ was talking about, initially the FDA was kind of forced into allowing DTC ads, basically by I think very legitimate threats from the industry and in the wake of the WLF litigation in the mid-90s. But FDA kind of came around to seeing the value of DTC ads because it engendered conversations between patients and doctors. So, nobody would have ever heard of or treated ED without, Viagra. And the CEO I used to work for talked about the most effective places for DTC ads are in what he called below the waistline issues. So genital warts. It's a lot easier to walk into your doctor and say, "Doctor, I need Viagra," than to start to talk about the actual issue. But what the experience was that maybe half the time you end up with the branded drug, but the other half of the time the doctor says, okay, you tell me that you need Viagra. Let's talk about why that might be. And that could lead to a conversation in which you end up treating somebody's blood pressure. You end up treating somebody's obesity. You end up treating other things, diabetes. And so ultimately, FDA really was not as hostile to DTC ads as it initially, was in the 90s, because they actually saw the utility of them. And they turned out to be kind of good for patients. And that's, at the end of the day, most of the people at FDA really do want things that are good for patients. They may have a different view of what that is, but that is why they got into the business, so to speak.
So you alluded to things that happened in the 90s to sort of open things up, to open things up a little bit more in the latter part of the 90s. Can you describe that a little bit more in terms of what was convincing to FDA to go a different route than they were?
Sure. Well, before the Washington Legal Foundation challenge to FDA's attempt to basically ban the dissemination of peer-reviewed journal articles, which Kessler decided when he decided he wanted to crack down on off-label speech. So WLF brought this, very, very thoughtful complaint and challenge. I got involved with it as well, as you know, and all of a sudden, there was a ruling that FDA was subject to the First Amendment, when before that, it had never believed that it was subject to the First Amendment. It believed that it had carte blanche to regulate speech. And all of a sudden, the FDA's needed to wrestle with the fact that if it was truthful, not misleading, and scientifically substantiated, that it had a First Amendment, claim and value. And FDA has been kind of bobbing and ducking and weaving and trying to avoid the First Amendment really ever since. But over time, it has been liberalizing speech. For example, now allows speech to pretty clear rules about allowing pre-approval communications with P&T, what are so-called P&T committees, formulary committees at payers. That was never really permitted before. It's clarified the rules about DTC ads. And the FDA has been forced to kind of, recognize that, speech is a good thing, as long as it's truthful, not misleading, scientifically substantiated.
CZ, you mentioned, or I mentioned at the outset that your fight with MS began in the early 90s. When advertising started to sort of increase after what Dan described, and especially at his time while at FDA as chief counsel, Were you pleased to see that increase in information exchange
Um,
as a patient and as a patient advocate?
yes, but truthfully, as a 20-year-old single guy, I had
That's
no clue.
fair.
I was, I was immortal. Nothing was happening to me. So, I didn't bother me about. I knew nothing about MS, or I didn't think it was any different than MD. And then I get walloped with my first symptom, and then my journey begins. So, but from that point forward, though, that's very telling, I think, for everyone, because everyone, uh, these are not ads that are going to appealing to the wide range of people. I think I'll take IBS, and I think I'll have Euro bowel syndrome. It's not these ads are meant for people who suffer from the ailment, and in that case, the ads are very important to informing the journey. Like I said, I myself use my own research, learning, and learned all I could about MS. And the great thing about my disease is that it allows me to straddle two worlds. When I first diagnosed, there was no drugs at all no DMT to slow the course. And by the end of the year, the first year, there was one approved. And so I got to experience what it was like. And there were ads for that drug. There were material that said there was, it helped alleviate, reduce the symptoms by a third, blah, blah, blah. And so the funny thing is that those ads informed me and my doctor about what I should and should not do. Lo and behold, the benefits I received, uh, the side effect I received taking that first drug was far in excess of what was disclosed in the ads. But the second drug that came online far exceeded what could ever be promised. It totally turned my life around. And long story short, the ads can never summarize exactly what the benefits are or the side effect perfectly. That's why the conversation it starts is so vital. Like the fact that you have people who would never otherwise talk to their doctors about what they're suffering from is unreal. We live in a world where not too long ago, I mocked the whole COVID thing just being so short time ago, but it was not too long ago, a generation where no one talked about depression, no one talked about stomach issues like they do now. But we've allowed people to come out of the shadows and treat their ailment and get healthier and make America healthier. So, which is why it's so ironic that you have RFKJ talking about over medicalization when why is that a patient problem? Like they don't have the script, they don't have the pad to write the script. Now, if you don't like that doctors are writing too many scripts, fine, but that's not you can't say that's because patients know too much. It's not a thing. And we know that from research and lived experience that no one's going in and getting, I demand this brand drug. No, what's happening is I demand to discuss with you what we could help treat my ailment. So, and increases the use of generic drugs, increases the use of other treatments. If the doctor can tell you, look, you can't solve your problem by this drug, this pill. It'll solve your problem by exercising, eating healthier. So these conversations are vital, and it's not a binary.
Thanks, Easy. So the crux of HHS's and FDA's problems with today's drug ads seem to center around this communication of the major statement that you had referred to, Dara. What were some of the specific concerns FDA expressed in these cease and desist letters that it sent back in September?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Despite the fact that the crackdown is called a DTC crackdown, a lot of the letters did not have to do with DTC TV ads. What we're seeing now in 2026, I think all but one letter has dealt with a TV ad, but there were many letters that were issued for websites and other types of promotional materials as well. I think generally speaking, FDA is taking the position that for disclosing risk information, there can't be any distractions. And what those distractions are might be the storyline of a commercial, the number of scene changes, other types of audio or visual components that might distract consumers in some way. But included among them are representations about the patient. and images or graphics that imply some type of improvement in quality of life and patient ability that might overstate the effect of a drug. So these are just some of the things that we are seeing in the letters that are coming out in 2026, as well as those that came out in September of 2025.
Dan, is this a sort of an announcement of a new direction or policy for FDA? And if that is the case, is there not a concern in terms of the way that they're doing that in terms of fair notice and also sort of as an overreach of the authority under the FDCA?
I think so. I mean, when I was chief counsel, first of all, we reviewed all untitled and warning letters, not just advertising ones, in the chief counsel's office. That innovation went away with the Obama administration. But if the federal government was accusing you of, I mean, these warning and untitled letters say you have violated federal law. And we kind of thought that, if the federal government's making that pronouncement, which can have all sorts of ramifications in follow-on litigation, in reputationally, legally, letters, are used by the plaintiff's bar in court, that it should be reviewed by a lawyer. Also, I required DDMAC to, what was then DDMAC, now again OPDP, to actually have a social scientist who is an expert in consumer perception to write a memo to the file, which said, this is how I understand, based on my expertise, that a consumer would understand this ad. I mean, in the FTC sphere, if you want to litigate an issue, you have to go out and survey consumers, right? FDA is frequently just making it up. Now, I don't know whether there were a lot of cuts to OPDP. I don't know whether they still have that capacity or that capability or that person is still there. So I think these letters are vulnerable on a variety of grounds. They may just be wrong in how they characterize the way consumers are perceiving the ad. They may be wrong in that the ads may well comply with a better reading of the regs. And we'll get into this, but at bottom, if these letters, if the ads are truthful, not misleading, and scientifically substantiated, there's a vulnerability, I think, under the First Amendment. So, and the best place to see the critique of these letters is once upon a time, for a while, WLF had something called DDMAC Watch, where it would critique every single letter that came out from DDMAC. And I think that repository is still available on the internet.
It is. That's correct.
And you can go see what a principled critique of those letters and of FDA's approach to advertising looks like. And my understanding, and Darryl probably know this better, is that quite a number of companies, in response to this, this dump of many letters in 2025, instead of, sort of as in the past, companies would say, okay, FDA, we got, we hear you. I think a fair number of companies have said, thank you for your letter, but, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing and, do something about it. And that's historically not the way things have worked with FDA. But, with this FDA, unfortunately, I think we're seeing that approach from companies more and more.
But Dan, you had mentioned that and your chief counsel's office often reviewed the letters before they went out. These letters, at least the initial group of them, weren't even sent from OPDP. They were sent from the heads of CDER and CBER. Was that telling to you that there wasn't enough oversight?
It was certainly noteworthy and bizarre. And then there are some people who think that some of these letters were AI generated. I don't know enough to know whether that was true or not true. Again, Darren may have a view on that, but there was nothing about these letters that looked like regular order. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, I would agree. I would just say, just to tack on a couple of things to what Dan said, which I agree with entirely. my understanding is that the April reduction in force got rid of the social scientists and regulatory counsel that were over at the Office of Prescription Drug Promotion. So I have no idea whether or not these letters are actually being routed through Office of Chief Counsel to determine whether or not they have any type of legal merit. And I'm talking about the entitled letters as well as the warning letters, because I find it shocking that some of the warning letters that were issued. How are you supposed to the letters to Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly for an Oprah special? How are you going to conduct a corrective ad? You're going to ask Oprah to do a corrective advertisement for Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk, and it wasn't even an advertisement. So I think that there are some questions about the legal scrutiny that was given to those letters. In terms of what's happening now, I think that there are many questions as to whether or not there's a legal ground for FDA to be standing on in terms of whether or not things are false or misleading. They seem to be alleging that certain representations are false or misleading. They're not citing to specific regulations the way they previously did. I think we also need to remember that in the DTC crackdown, what was captured was not just pharmaceutical sponsor advertising, but also telehealth platform and compounding pharmacy advertisements. And so I think that part of the reason that maybe George Tidmarsh, and as the head of CEDAR, was issuing all of these letters, which all were issued within like a 20-minute period. If you look at the time stamps of all of the letters that were issued, it was like between like 5:06 p.m. and 5:20 something p.m. Right? He was signing them on behalf of the Office of Prescription Drug Promotion that was ultimately going to be getting responses, as well as the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, or the compounding folks, when he was issuing those to the telehealth platforms. Again, I think it's a numbers game. I think if you were to break it down, you had like 40 letters issued to telehealth platforms, 60 letters issued to pharmaceutical sponsors. And then when you think about the fact that the letters were issued per promotional piece, instead of historically, they would do it by brand, mentioning all of the promotional pieces as part of it, the actual number of issues was smaller.
So because Dara mentioned it, let's jump into the independently produced online stories or news segments. Dan, that she mentioned, the Oprah thing, is that something that you had seen before at FDA, and is that something that would hold up in court if that was ever challenged?
I don't think it would hold up in court at all. I mean, FDA's jurisdiction runs to pharmaceutical manufacturers. That's where it begins and ends. And if Oprah decides to do something, even if the company sort of prompted her to do it, right? I mean, unless they paid her to do it, right? But if someone independently mentions a drug, again, even if prompted by the company, but not necessarily paid by the company, then they are simply immune from FDA regulation. And if you don't take that position, then FDA, would really run rampant over the First Amendment and would be repressing all of everybody's ability to speak about medicines, which is just an absurd proposition. It's an absurd proposition from a statutory perspective, and it's an absurd proposition from a regulatory perspective. It's absurd from a policy perspective, and it's absurd from a constitutional perspective. I mean, FDA's regulation runs to those who are distributing drugs. And the telehealth issue is complicated. Some of these telehealth companies are vertically integrated and are actually own the compounding pharmacies and are sending the drugs out. So they're prescribing it and then they're sending it out. I think FDA actually can regulate them. But if you're just a pure telehealth play and you are just, prescribing it and you're not involved in the distribution of the drug, FDA can't regulate you.
CZ, what role do you think media coverage, third-party coverage of pharmaceuticals play in empowering patients, and what problems would that present to patient education if that was curtailed in any way because of FDA targeting independently produced online stories or news segments?
Well, I think patients inform themselves through thousands of ways, through their caregivers, through their family networks, through advertisements, through the conversation with doctors. Like the idea that we're going to boil the ocean here is crazy, and I don't understand. One thing I want to get to is the other side of the coin here. Dara brought up earlier about distracting advertising that can skew people's perceptions of ads, and I want to bring up because it's a two-way street, right? There are ads. Look, I've been on drugs that have exceeded the worst of the side effects, and I've been on drugs that have far exceeded the best of the benefits. So, how you can now? It's not a complaint. It's just I think a balance is right. You should give a flavor of it all, so you can take that information to your doctor and then weigh the best course for you. So, as a patient, you take on risk rewards, and I'm wholly embrace that. But for example, Dara, I'm just curious. I've seen many ads. I've been on a drug that came with a very real warning about PML, which is a deadly brain virus. Right? I've also seen ads that for drugs that have no sign of PML, have no sign of it in their clinical trial, yet they are forced to mention it. Now, I think it's distracting to say force an ad, force a solution for someone to say this drug might kill you and even though we never show up in a trial, there's perhaps a cohort somewhere down the line, we're forced to say it, but that's distracting. That's majorly distracting. So I think what's distorting them is this approach to policing every sentence of an FDA approved. Don't forget, these are FDA approved meds. These are medicines. These are not single things. They're drugs that the FDA has already said are approved for use. And I think the fact that after the fact we're going to silence the medical information that is shared both by the ad, by a news organization, by general conversation is crazy. I mean, like Dan said, they're going to go after. I'm sorry, I have a problem. If Oprah took a little something to promote a clinically approved drug, like that's okay. I mean, we're in America. Last time I checked. So I find it really disturbing. For example, last thing I'll say on this, there's a bill on Capitol Hill on the Senate side that's being proposed to silence the ability for an innovator to promote the discovery of a drug for 2 years after it's approved. What? Like that it should be illegal not to talk about it. Like that should be. I mean, if a drug was discovered that would help my kid and no one was allowed to discuss it, I'd be like, what the heck? I mean, why are you hiding the ball on me? Like that to me is a self-hating instinct to say we want to be proud of a discovery. The FDA has approved. No one's saying is guesswork. I just think that we're getting so far away from what we are as a people. Free people is about helping and being a healthier country, and I think it just is really sideways.
Dara, I think CZ brings up an interesting point about arguments that can be made to say that what FDA finds distracting or is requiring can itself be distracting. Is that something that drug companies can look into or consider if they have to make First Amendment arguments at some point?
Yeah, I mean, so much of this is subjective. And I think that's why the Office of Prescription Drug Promotion used to have a list on its website of all of the research projects that it was engaging in to understand, how consumers or physicians were receiving information and processing information and determine when the delivery of that information might be confusing or misleading, and then be able to substantiate their assertions that something is distracting and therefore false or misleading in some way. That program has been abolished. And we have, assertions that certain, presentations are distracting or confusing. I think that, what Dan said is absolutely accurate. These are things that if the Federal Trade Commission were bringing up, like you would be doing studies to determine consumer comprehension and say, no, this is not distracting. and they could be challenged. But because it's so subjective, and because the initial issue of receiving an untitled letter or a warning letter is bad PR, and not something that any company really wants to get. I think it could have a chilling effect on how companies proceed and whether or not they're going to move forward with television ads for their products, understanding that it's now a riskier space in terms of getting a letter.
Can I jump in here, Glenn? Just
Sure, of
quickly?
course.
Because Dara brings up a good point. There's so much subjectivity, and frankly, I don't really care for a office doing social science research to help inform the body that's regulating on what their findings are. Well, that's a step in the right direction. But why are we looking at outcomes? Why are we looking at, are people getting healthier? Like, for example, why is it your opinion that you don't like 70s jingles to be in advertising? Why is that? What does that have to do with anything? If people are getting healthier, are they able to get themselves off of other drugs or making themselves live longer? Like that should be the outcome. We should be looking for a healthy America, not America that has earworms and that bothers you. I mean, who cares? Who cares if some, again, failed 70s tune is the riff on a jingle? I mean, the point here is that, or that patients are portrayed doing things that they shouldn't be able to do. Well, hell, man, no one ever told me when I got my MS drug, the second one approved, it would lead to, the side effect for me was a happy married life with 4 sons, healthy life. They all paying 2 kids in the military. Like, these are side effects that were not verified, but they are the real ones. So instead of trying to debate whether or not they should be included in the results, we should just say, look, let's look at how things work in the real world and allow information to flow forward and people to make their own choice with a doctor, with verified information, and go forward. Let's pursue a healthier America.
So in announcing the crackdown, FDA indicated that it would initiate rulemaking to, quote, eliminate the adequate provision loophole. Dan, loophole is really kind of a loaded term here. What exactly is FDA getting at saying that?
So before the 90s, basically when FDA was under pressure, crafted a realistic path for DTC ads to be broadcast, there was essentially a de facto ban on broadcast advertising because the disclosures that were required were so onerous that you couldn't fit them into a 1 or 2 or 3 minute ad. And so it was a de facto ban. And so what FDA did in the late 90s, in 97, I think, was say, okay, here's a way that you can do a direct-to-consumer ad, a broadcast ad, and it doesn't have to be 15 or 20 minutes. You don't have to read out the non-brief, non-summary. It's like the Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't holy, wasn't Roman, wasn't empire. The brief summary is neither brief nor a summary. And as we all know, you still have, more safety disclosures than statements about efficacy in these DTC ads, but at least they allowed a path forward. So this is the quote unquote loophole that some are talking about trying to repeal. Now, there are a number of problems with this. First of all, again, I think the FDA understood that a de facto ban was not going to be constitutionally sustainable. Since that time, we have had actually legislation in 2007, which kind of, legitimizes, if you will, DTC ads. FDA now has, put out regs, it has put out guidance. So the idea that you could go back to a de facto ban on these ads, I think is just ridiculous. It's chimerical. I mean, the Supreme Court has protected advertising of gambling, of alcohol, and the idea that it's not going to protect advertising that's truthful, not misleading, scientifically substantiated about life-saving medications just seems to me to be absurd. I think it's a 9-0 loss at the Supreme Court.
How about on statutory grounds, Dan? Is there strong arguments there? Obviously, as we know, courts often do constitutional avoidance, and they'd rather rule on statutory grounds or overreach grounds than on First Amendment.
Well, yeah. So I actually think that that the statute would be read against the background of the First Amendment, and I think avoidance is absolutely the way it would go. But even, applying Loper Bright and coming up with the best reading of the statute says, in the case of an advertisement, this is the statute. The case of an advertisement for a drug, blah, 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 this title, the major statement relating to side effects and contraindications shall be presented in a clear, conspicuous, and neutral manner. And so basically, Congress has said, yes, we are essentially recognizing that DTC ads can be broadcast, and this is the way that you can do it, with, again, a major statement that's clear, clear, conspicuous, and neutral. To require disclosures that are so onerous as to be a de facto ban, I think is completely inconsistent with the statute. And, as is often the case, this administration said the quiet part out loud. They've basically said they want to do a de facto ban. Well, a de facto ban on truthful, not misleading, scientifically substantiated drug advertising will not pass the laugh test in any court.
Dara, would you like to elaborate a little bit on the First Amendment angle that Dan brought up?
Sure. I mean, I agree. I think that having to disclose the brief summary as part of the commercial, which is essentially what they want to do here. They want to turn a 30-second, 60-second commercial into a 5-minute long commercial that will essentially drive pharmaceutical companies away from doing TV ads. They don't want to allow adequate provision, which is a direction for consumers on how to get more information. But to do that is compelled speech that I'm not sure is entirely necessary. Like what is the substantial interest of the government in compelling that speech to be as part of the commercial, especially now that we have much more high-tech ways of being able to disseminate that information. I mean, as someone who's watched like my Prime TV and has had like commercials pop up where I'm able to just add it to my Amazon cart, from watching the commercial on Prime TV. What's to say that we couldn't have QR codes appear on commercials that drive consumers to the prescribing information for the product, or links that you can click on with a magic remote that will get you to the website for the drug. I think that there are much more highly advanced technological ways to be able to have the brief summary or the prescribing information be able to accompany some of these broadcast ads, and pharmaceutical companies can get creative on how to do so.
Dara, I think you nailed it in your answer, in your response there. The fact is, they want to add so many onerous disclosures that they're going to shut down the ad entirely, make it impossible. And sounds like that might seemingly be the point of the effort, and which saddened me greatly, because we know, as I described, they can never cover all the downsides and benefits in an ad. So if you can tease it, again, they're not like it's not like a consumer product where I'm choosing going to the store and say, I'll take one Humira, I'll take some Ozempic. You have to go through your doctor, have that conversation. If that conversation is informed, it allows you to then decide amongst your caregiving to go and pursue, with your doctor's permission, a script that could make your life healthier. So if we focused on health outcomes instead of the subjective opinion of these guys in the ad look too happy, that's idiotic. Or that they don't repeat really nasty things about the drug enough. I think that's obscuring someone from. I'm not gonna tell my nephew about something that could cure his schizophrenia because I heard that he's gonna kill himself. Like that's the obscuring the information to make people healthier is as bad as any censorship. So I think we need to own up to the fact that this effort is what's really doing is trying to really strangle off the medical information that people deserve.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, Derek, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say it contradicts prior FDA guidance. I mean, FDA issued guidance on consumer brief summaries, and being able to provide a brief summary in consumer-friendly language that was more streamlined. And they had done studies that showed that 40% of consumers couldn't read a typical brief summary, as Dan was saying, which was neither brief nor summary, and had lots of technical language and words that were just not comprehensible. So, given the previous push to make information more consumer friendly and more understandable, the push now, presumably with getting rid of adequate provision to include, all of the information that's in the prescribing information is not intended to create radical transparency or to create improved consumer comprehension or consumer education about prescription drug. It is intended to ban prescription drug advertising on TV.
CZ, I was curious in your patients project whether you talked to doctors about their impressions of direct-to-consumer advertising and the interactions that they have with their patients. Have you learned anything from those sort of interactions?
I have, and we all, from our own experiences, usually in both my specific ones about this topic, you learn from doctors that they have 6 minutes with their patients. They have no time. They barely have time to even look at a chart, let alone do all the research on everything that this patient could be ailing from. And in fact, most doctors would tell you that they welcome being given a little cheat sheet on saying, doctor, I feel like I have this feeling in my leg. I saw an ad that tells me it could be a central problem. So, and it helps tease what could be a solution for a doctor who has very limited time these days. So these things, they don't want, I think Dr. Makary has acknowledged it. It does not, the idea that doctors are off-put by being bullied to write branded scripts is ludicrous, because these things, having a two-way conversation with a patient should be our goal, not a one-way one, a broadcast that is government approved. So I think doctors, my experience anecdotally and seeing surveys, is that doctors welcome having informed patients.
I mentioned again that if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box. So Dan, as I noted in my introduction, the FDA Commissioner has said on social media a few weeks ago that this crackdown is just getting started. So what do you think would be the most advantageous sort of continuing approach for the healthcare marketplace? Would it be FDA proposing a rule that would at least allow some notice and comment, issue some sort of guidance, or just continue case-by-case enforcement by warning letter and speech and social media posts? What do you think would be the best out of potentially bad outcomes out of those?
Well, the best thing for the healthcare market would be for there to be a recognition that information is good, right? Knowledge is good, to quote Animal House, and that these are constitutionally protected, but also do actually serve patients, as CZ is articulately put. Look, I mean, I was on a panel recently with the outgoing head of the Office of Policy, and I asked her, how long these days does it take for a reg to go from NPRM, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, through final? And she said 8 years. Okay. I don't see the Trump administration at HHS doing regs at all. And I think that's because they know that doing regs is really long and difficult and complicated and a team sport, and requires, actually the cooperation of career staff, because you need somebody to do a cost benefit analysis and a paperwork reduction analysis. And it's really complicated. When I was chief counsel, we did get something called the Orange Book rule about Hatch-Waxman through in 3 years, NPRM to final, but I had the White House buy-in on that, and the White House was completely backing that. And even then, it took 3 years. I mean, we got some bioterrorism regs out within 6 months because we were required to do so. But I don't see them drafting a reg on this. I mean, I know that the regulatory agenda says that they're going to come out with an NPRM in Q1. I don't believe it, in part because, and I know some of the lawyers who are, who would be reviewing this, and they understand that there's a massive First Amendment issue here, never mind a massive Loper-Bright problem here, and, arbitrary and capricious issues. And so I don't expect a reg to see the light of day. And certainly if there was an NPRM, pharma would make very clear, I believe, I'm not speaking for pharma, but I'm pretty sure they would make very clear that they would litigate if this thing, ever got to a final. And I just don't believe that it's going to get over the goal line. And by and large, this administration seems more interested in headlines than in good policy, and they've already gotten the headlines on the DTC crackdown. I think they're if they put out more letters, they'll get more headlines, but I don't see really an appetite for a reg, and I do think that everybody understands that if they actually did a reg and got it to final, it would be pretty much of a non-starter.
Darren, any thoughts on that? I will say, from our experience at WLF, FDA is notorious for proposing regulations, just letting them hang out there as proposals for a long time, trying to find ways to basically enforce the proposed regulation and waiting for industry to challenge them on that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think this administration is about the headlines when it comes to DTC crackdown. And they've been issuing letters quickly. I think we saw, the more recent letter. I can't say it's the most recent letter, but the letter that was issued, last week on the Wegovy pill, where the commercial just aired maybe 4 weeks before the letter came out. I think that they were capitalizing on the fact that this was a highly anticipated product, and there would be a lot of public attention, and FDA could issue a letter and capitalize on that. And I think that that's what this is all about. It's all about generating headlines and how active the Office of Prescription Drug Promotion is for issuing these letters. I don't know where a proposed rule would go. I tend to agree that it would likely languish, and I don't think that anything that was going to kind of roll back the adequate provision approach that has historically been taken for almost 30 years now is necessary to protect the public health or that it's going to, be required or, withstand statutory scrutiny.
CZ, is there any sort of appetite on the Hill, sort of harkening back to your legislative experience for any kind of oversight or looking into this? I know you'd mentioned the bill that Senator King had issued, but are there people on the Hill that would be willing to push back against what FDA is doing here?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, given that, like I said, I think I said it. I feel like this TTC push is a solution in search of a problem. Like, there's so many things in FDA's purview that are of concern. There are food products. There are other activities that ought to deserve more scrutiny. And why the emphasis here is like it feels like it's everyone's favorite whipping boy right now, because everyone hates big pharma, but the fact is I wish they would get back to look. I'm all for sending out letters, wagging fingers at makers of drugs that may overstep, and they should enforce rules they have right now to make sure everyone stays in compliance. But the idea that they would go further is nuts. And the Hill, Glenn, as you know and everyone knows, is a little bit of a to have a few things wrapped around the axle right now. And going into a midterm, I don't see much action there. There could be oversight, and there deserves to be always oversight. But here, I think this is an issue that we should be looking at health outcomes of Americans. Are people healthier? We should not be getting angry because someone is making money or on a brand name drug or is off a brand name drug for that matter. But it should be about are we moving the needle on mortality? Are we moving the needle on health? And we should be looking at metrics like that, not on whether or not we have too many people smiling in ads.
Yeah, let me just jump in. One of the things that people get some traction or discussion on the Hill is a disallowance of taking a tax exemption for money spent on DTC advertising. I think that's constitutionally vulnerable as well, because it is a content-based restriction. I mean, you can't say, well, we're going to not allow tax deductions for DTC drug ads, but we're going to allow it for tax deductions for Coca-Cola ads. Now, Now, if they want to get rid of tax deductibility for all advertising, I think maybe they could do that. They have pretty broad authority over the tax, the tax laws, but I don't think a content-based restriction would hold water. And the last thing is, I think we should concede that DTC advertising, first of all, can be very annoying. And very few people like watching, something with their 8-year-old and then, it's the Super Bowl and then there's an ED commercial. No, that can be uncomfortable. And DTC advertising, one of the reasons why companies do it is because if you walk into a doctor and you ask for Wegovy or Ozempic, you're more likely, if the doctor's going to prescribe that drug, to get the branded drug that you have asked for. Okay. But that doesn't mean, and this is to ZZC's point, that doctors are just sitting there saying, oh, that's what you asked for. Okay, I'm going to give it to you. That's just not the way doctors behave. I had a conversation with a doctor yesterday about medication. I came in and I said, I think I need to go to this dose. He's like, no, we're going to go to this dose. and he wrote whatever prescription he wanted, not the prescription that I wanted. I came in as a pretty informed consumer. My brother-in-law is a rheumatologist, and I discussed this with him. So, doctors they're not pushovers. My wife's a doctor; she's no pushover, and they exercise independent judgment. That's the thing that people don't seem to remember, right? I mean, this is not something that the consumer is bamboozled and goes out and buys off the shelf. The consumer needs to have a conversation with the doctor.
Exactly.
To close out, I'm sorry, CZ, go ahead.
No, I was just going to emphasize Dan's exactly right. It's a pet peeve of mine, but patients are not consumers in the pure sense. We're not choosing our drugs like that. And certainly we're not going to buy at the a point of purchase sale. We're going to our doctor. They have agency too. They went through a lot of school. They have medical certification boards that they go through. They don't just write whatever we tell them to do. Trust me, I tried to bully doctors. It doesn't work. So at the end of the day, we should be focused on health outcomes and how we're getting healthier as a country, not on who's taking what pill or not. And so I think with more information is better than less.
I want to finish with a general question. Dara, is there a risk here if FDA is successful in continuing to do this without a sufficient pushback that it's going to create a slippery slope? FDA has a huge regulatory oversight over food and tobacco and other products. And should those industries be concerned that if things work here the way that FDA wants, that there'll be sort of side effects on food advertising or other types of advertising?
Possibly. I mean, food advertising is primarily under
FTC,
Federal Trade
right.
Commission's jurisdiction.
Yeah.
And so, I think that, certainly there is a possibility. But I think the greater risk here is the subjectivity of some of the content in these letters and the fact that the letters are coming out themselves, because I do think that it's going to have a chilling effect on speech. I don't think that any individual company is really positioned to bring a lawsuit against FDA for a letter. And I think when we think about the drop-off in letters that happened a number of years ago, it was prompted by a number of First Amendment lawsuits that had been brought that FDA was losing over and over again. There's a distinct drop-off after August 2015, right? All of a sudden we started seeing, maybe 5 to 10 letters a year, as opposed to the letter a week approach that had been taking place, back in 2012, 2011. So, I wonder whether or not we're just going to start recreating the timeline here. And it's going to continue until we get some big player that's going to be willing to take it to court and challenge it. And then we'll have that drop off happen again later. But I think it's misguided, and I don't ultimately think that it's in the best interest for patients generally.
So I agree. It is also a risk actually to FDA to be taking legally unsustainable positions. It's not good for anybody in the industry for FDA to be taking positions that, basically industry says, you know what, No, we don't believe you, right? Make us, right? I mean, that's just not really where, FDA has gotten where it's gotten, and we as a society have gotten where we've gotten because largely of voluntary compliance. But people aren't going to voluntarily comply if what FDA is expecting is illegal and unreasonable.
Well, we're right at 2. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. Dara, Dan, ZZ, thanks for spending your time with us for an hour and providing some, I think, some really insightful commentary and a lot of things to think about that our viewers will certainly have. If you have a moment after when you sign off, there's a survey to let us know what you think of the program and how we're doing. Really appreciate that. And this will be available in a couple of hours on YouTube and on WLF's website as a recorded program. Again, thank you for joining us.